There are stories in this world that remind us why we're human. Stories that don't offer us heroes on pedestals, but rather broken people who somehow found the courage to stand again. This is one of those stories. It's about a man whose voice could move thousands to tears, yet who couldn't stop his own world from shattering. It's about love that promised forever but couldn't survive the weight of human weakness. It's about a fall so public and so devastating that most people would never have shown their face again. And it's about a redemption so raw and honest that it changed not just one life, but touched the hearts of everyone who had ever failed and wondered if they could ever be whole again. This is the story of Michael English, a gospel music legend, who lost everything he held sacred and spent years in the wilderness trying to find his way back home. Michael English wasn't just any gospel singer. By the early 1990s, his name had become synonymous with excellence in Christian music. His voice carried a rare combination of technical perfection and emotional depth that could silence a room of thousands or bring comfort to a single soul in their darkest hour. When he sang about grace, people believed him. When he sang about redemption, they felt it in their bones. He had won the highest honors his industry could offer, stood on the biggest stages, and earned the admiration of peers and fans alike. But more importantly, he had built what seemed to be a beautiful life rooted in faith and family values. Alongside his wife Lisa, he appeared to embody everything the Christian community held dear. Together they were raising their daughter, navigating the complexities of fame with apparent grace, and serving as a living example of what a godly marriage should look like. Lisa English was more than just Michael's wife. She was his anchor during the whirlwind years of his rising career. While he traveled from city to city, performing night after night, she maintained their home and created stability for their daughter. She believed in his calling, supported his ministry, and stood beside him through 11 years of marriage that from the outside looked like a testament to commitment and shared faith. They had weathered the ordinary challenges that every marriage faces, the stress of financial pressures in the early years, the exhaustion of new parenthood, the adjustments required when success finally came. Through it all, they seemed united by something deeper than romantic love alone. They shared a conviction that their lives were meant to serve a higher purpose, that Michael's gift was meant to point people towards something greater than themselves. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ideal Christian marriage, fractures were forming. The gospel music industry, for all its talk of righteousness and holy living, operates within the same flawed human systems as any other entertainment business. The constant travel creates distance between spouses. The adulation from fans can feed dangerous appetites for validation and attention. The pressure to maintain a perfect public image makes it nearly impossible to address private struggles before they become catastrophic. And the spiritual warfare that artists in this field talk about isn't just rhetoric. When you're spending your life singing about battles between light and darkness, sometimes those battles become intensely personal. Michael was fighting demons he didn't fully understand, wrestling with temptations that his public persona wouldn't allow him to acknowledge, struggling under the weight of expectations that left no room for human weakness. Then came 1994, a year that would change everything. Michael English stood at the absolute pinnacle of his career. He had just swept the Dove Awards, taking home multiple honors including the prestigious Artist of the Year award. He was being celebrated as one of the brightest lights in contemporary Christian music. His latest album was climbing the charts. Churches and venues across the country were clamoring to book him. Everything he had worked for was finally paying off in ways that exceeded even his most ambitious dreams. And then, in what must rank as one of the most dramatic falls from grace in the history of gospel music, it all came crashing down. Just days after his triumphant night at the Dove Awards, Michael made a confession that would send shockwaves through the Christian community. He had been involved in an adulterous affair with another gospel artist. The revelation didn't just end his career momentum. It detonated his entire life. Within days, his record label pulled his album from stores and distribution. Churches that had welcomed him as a minister through music now wanted nothing to do with him. Concert venues canceled his bookings. Christian radio stations stopped playing his songs. Fellow artists distanced themselves. The industry that had lifted him to stardom now treated him like a contagious disease. But the professional consequences, devastating as they were, paled in comparison to the personal wreckage. His confession didn't just damage his reputation, it destroyed the foundation of trust in his marriage. Lisa, who had sacrificed so much to support his career, now had to process the reality that the man she had committed her life to had betrayed that commitment in the most intimate way possible, and she had to do it while the entire Christian world watched and whispered and judged. The affair itself became a matter of intense public scrutiny and speculation, but what often gets lost in the scandal is the human cost paid by everyone involved. Lisa had to wake up each day and face the knowledge that her private pain was public entertainment, that people were discussing her marriage in church parking lots and over dinner tables, that her daughter would grow up knowing that her father's moral failure had been broadcast across the Christian community. Michael's daughter, still so young, had to navigate a childhood where other kids knew what her father had done, where the sense of family security she had known was suddenly gone, where the faith community that should have been a source of comfort became a place of judgment and exclusion. And Lisa had to make impossible decisions. Should she try to save the marriage despite the betrayal? Should she protect herself and her daughter by walking away? How could she possibly know what God wanted her to do when her spiritual leader, her partner in ministry, had proven so catastrophically fallible? The divorce, when it finally came, wasn't just a legal dissolution of a marriage contract. It represented the death of a shared vision, the end of a ministry partnership, the collapse of a family structure that had been built around faith and service. Neither Michael nor Lisa spoke extensively in public about the specific details of their separation, and in their silence there was perhaps a last vestige of dignity and protection for their daughter. But those who knew them understood that both were suffering immensely. Lisa had to rebuild a life she never expected to be living, creating a new identity as a single mother rather than the wife of a gospel music star. She had to find her own relationship with a faith community that had sometimes seemed to value her husband's talent more than her humanity. She had to help her daughter make sense of why their family had fallen apart when they were supposed to be examples of Christian living. For Michael, the aftermath of the scandal and the divorce plunged him into a darkness he had never imagined possible. In his later memoir, The Prodigal Comes Home, he would describe these years with unflinching honesty, painting a portrait of a man who had lost not just his career and his family, but his sense, identity, and purpose. He wrote about sleepless nights haunted by regret, about the crushing weight of shame that made it hard to breathe, about looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back. The man who had spent years singing about God's love now felt utterly cut off from that love. The artist who had brought comfort to millions couldn't find any comfort for himself. He had built his entire adult life around being Michael English, the gospel singer, Michael English, the minister through music, Michael English, the example of Christian manhood. Now all of those identities had been stripped away, and he didn't know who he was supposed to be. What tormented Michael perhaps more than anything else was the recognition of how much damage his choices had caused. He could face the loss of his career. He could endure the public humiliation and the rejection from an industry he had served, but he couldn't escape the knowledge that he had devastated the people who had trusted him most completely. His wife had believed in him, had organized her entire life around supporting his calling, and he had repaid that devotion with betrayal. His daughter would carry the scars of his failure throughout her childhood and beyond. The fans who had looked to him for spiritual inspiration felt deceived and confused. The other artists he had worked with found their own reputations tainted by association with him. Every person whose life had intersected with his had been hurt by the choices he made. That realization was almost too much to bear. In the years immediately following the divorce, Michael English essentially vanished from public life. He didn't release new Christian music for nearly 3 years. He stopped performing. He withdrew from the community that had once celebrated him. This wasn't a strategic retreat or a calculated comeback plan. It was a kind of a spiritual and emotional exile, a necessary withdrawal from a world where he no longer knew how to function. During this period, he found refuge with friends Ashley and Wayne Judd, though the document mentions them as Ashley and Juana Judd. These were people who understood something about grace and second chances, who had walked their own difficult paths, and could offer Michael more than judgment. They provided him with a safe space to begin the painful work of examining his life, confronting his failures, and trying to rebuild some kind of foundation for moving forward. But even in the safety of that refuge, Michael struggled intensely. He battled with depression that made each day feel like an insurmountable challenge. He grappled with questions about his faith that he had never allowed himself to ask before. If God's grace was real, why did he feel so completely abandoned? If redemption was possible, why did the path back seem impossible to find? He also fell into struggles with prescription drug use, self-medicating against both physical pain and the emotional anguish that threatened to consume him. The man who had once stood before thousands proclaiming the power of God to transform lives, now couldn't seem to transform his own. The voice that had sung about freedom from bondage now belonged to someone trapped in cycles of addiction and despair. The testimony that had moved hearts now felt like a lie he had told himself and everyone else. Yet even in that darkness, something was beginning to shift. The exile that felt like punishment was actually becoming a crucible where something new could be forged. Away from the spotlight and the expectations and the pressure to maintain an image, Michael began to encounter his faith in a completely different way. He had spent years performing religion, using his gift to create emotional experiences for audiences, speaking the language of transformation while remaining fundamentally unchanged himself. Now, stripped of all the trappings of success and forced to confront who he really was, he started to experience rather than simply proclaim the truths he had been singing about. Grace stopped being a theological concept he could explain and became the only thing keeping him alive. Forgiveness stopped being something he offered to audiences through song and became something he desperately needed for himself. Redemption stopped being a triumphant narrative arc and became a slow, painful, unglamorous process of showing up each day and trying to do the next right thing. This transformation didn't happen quickly or dramatically. There was no single moment of revelation where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, it was a gradual awakening that unfolded over months and years. Michael had to learn to forgive himself, which proved harder than seeking forgiveness from others. He had to develop genuine humility, not the false modesty that entertainers often perform, but the real recognition that he was fundamentally broken and needed help. He had to rebuild his relationship with God from the ground up, letting go of the version of faith that had been tied to his success and his image, and finding something more authentic and sustainable. He had to accept that some things he had destroyed could never be fully repaired, that his marriage to Lisa was over, that his daughter's childhood had been marked by trauma he caused, that some people would never trust him again and had every right to maintain that boundary. When Michael English finally began to emerge from his exile and return to music, he came back as a fundamentally different person. The polish and perfection that had characterized his earlier performances were gone. In their place was a vulnerability that was sometimes uncomfortable to witness. He no longer presented himself as someone who had all the answers, as a spiritual guide who could lead others to higher ground. Instead, he showed up as someone who had been lost and was still finding his way, someone who had failed catastrophically and was learning to live with the consequences. His new music reflected this change. Albums like The Prodigal Comes Home weren't celebrations of victory but honest explorations of the journey from brokenness toward healing. The songs acknowledged pain and regret without offering easy resolutions. His voice still had all its technical power, but now it carried the weight of lived experience, the texture of real suffering and hard-won hope. This authenticity connected with audiences in ways his earlier perfection never had. People who had been hurt by the church's tendency to demand flawlessness while offering little grace for failure found in Michael's story permission to be honest about their own struggles. Listeners who had been carrying shame about their own mistakes heard in his music a message that resonance was still possible even after devastating failure. The gospel community, which had so quickly rejected him at the height of scandal, slowly began to make space for him again, not because they had forgotten what he did, but because his willingness to own his failures and speak honestly about the process of trying to become better resonated with the core message of Christianity itself. This is what grace actually looks like, messy and complicated and ongoing rather than neat and instantaneous and complete. Through all of this, Lisa English remained a significant presence in Michael's story, even in her absence from his daily life. He has consistently spoken about her with respect and remorse in interviews and public statements. He has never tried to shift blame for the failure of their marriage or minimize the pain his choices caused her. He has acknowledged that she bore burdens she never should have had to carry, that she maintained dignity and grace under circumstances that would have justified bitterness and recrimination. Their daughter, now grown, represents the enduring connection between them, a reminder that even after divorce, they remain linked by the family they created together. Michael has been open about the fact that his relationship with his daughter has been complicated by his past choices that rebuilding trust with has been a long and ongoing process, that some wounds take years or even decades to heal. Lisa herself has largely stayed out of the public eye, which speaks to a different kind of strength than the public redemption narrative Michael has embraced. She didn't owe the Christian community an explanation or a testimony. She didn't need to turn her pain into content or her healing into a platform. Her silence has been dignified and self-protective, focused on creating a life for herself and her daughter away from the scrutiny that comes with being connected to a public figure. Those who know her story respect the grace she has shown in not using her position to seek revenge or settle scores, in not exploiting the public's curiosity about her perspective on events that shaped her life so profoundly. She represents something important in this narrative, the reality that not everyone's path to healing looks like a comeback tour, that sometimes strength means walking away and building something new rather than trying to restore what was broken. Today, Michael English continues to perform and record and share his story with anyone willing to listen. His ministry, if it can still be called that, looks nothing like what it was in his early years of success. He's no longer trying to be an example of Christian perfection or a model of how faith should be lived. Instead, he offers himself as evidence that transformation is possible, even for people who have failed spectacularly, that grace can reach even those who seem to have fallen too far, that there is always a path back for those willing to take it one honest step at a time. His concerts now include moments where he speaks directly about his journey, not sanitizing the difficult parts or rushing to the redemption at the end, but honoring the full complexity of what it means to lose everything and slowly, painfully, build something new from the ruins. The legacy of Michael English is complicated and will probably always remain so. He cannot undo the hurt he caused. He cannot give Lisa back the years she lost or restore his daughter's childhood innocence. He cannot erase the disillusionment felt by fans who had believed he was something he never actually was. But he has done something perhaps equally important. He has refused to hide from his failures, refused to rewrite history to make himself look better, refused to offer a false narrative of easy redemption that would be more comfortable for everyone involved. He has instead chosen to be ruthlessly honest about the reality of his journey, about how low he fell and how hard it has been to climb back, about the ongoing nature of healing and the ways that consequences persist even after forgiveness has been offered and received. In doing so, Michael English has given something valuable to everyone who has ever felt destroyed by their own choices. He has demonstrated that it is possible to survive your worst moment, that identity can be rebuilt even after it has been shattered, that purpose can be found even after you have betrayed your own stated values. He has shown that grace is not just a nice idea churches talk about, but a real force that can sustain human life, even in the darkest valleys. He has proven that honesty, even when it costs you everything, is ultimately the only foundation strong enough to build a genuine life upon. His voice, once known for its technical brilliance and emotional power in worship settings, now carries a different kind of authority. The authority of someone who has walked through fire and can speak authentically about what it takes to keep moving forward when everything you thought you knew about yourself has turned out to be wrong. That's a message the world desperately needs to hear. And Michael English, broken and rebuilding, continues to sing it with every breath. Michael English's story isn't just about one man's fall and redemption. It's about every single person who has ever looked in the mirror and wondered if they've gone too far, if they've hurt too many people, if the damage they've caused can ever be repaired. It's about the quiet battle between who we pretend to be and who we actually are. His journey reminds us that grace isn't earned through perfection but discovered in our brokenness. That forgiveness isn't a one-time event but a daily practice. That redemption doesn't erase the past, but gives us the courage to face it honestly and keep moving forward anyway. If you've ever felt like your mistakes define you, if you've ever wondered whether there's a way back from your darkest moment, Michael's story offers something precious. Hope that isn't naive but earned through years of painful honesty. The voice that once sang about grace from a position of success now testifies to it from a place of genuine transformation. And that testimony, raw and unpolished and real, speaks to the possibility that all of us, no matter how far we've fallen, can find our way home. The question is whether we're brave enough to take that first honest step.